Thank you, Deputy Speaker. For the benefit of those opposite, I'm actually a proud dairy farmer myself. So I take this issue very seriously. And let's be really frank here, this is just another Labor government tax, because it's either another tax on farmers directly or it's a tax on fresh food, as the member has just spoken about, and it is cost shifting by the government. It's just, when you look at it, farmers are already paying $500 million a year in various levies. We're already paying that amount of money. And for those who have no experience in farming, my husband and I bought our first dairy farm property on the day we got married. And in those days, we bought a rundown old property. It was all we could afford, and we had a massive debt. So our interest and payments were $1,300 a month, and in those days you struggled to make $2,000. We had to do all that work ourselves to build the property and to do the work ourselves to even stay in farming. That's how tough it was. And so we actually do need governments that support us, and young people who want to get into this industry need the support of a good government that says we value and respect those of you who produce some of the best food and fibre in the world. No question. But this is, as a fresh food tax, this is when farmers have no choice but to pass on that additional $50 million every year that they're going to cop on this one, a recurring cost to either farmers or consumer, because this tax adds to the cost of production. That's how it is on your farm. And, you know, I don't know what those opposite think life on a farm is. It is really hard work. I got a message this morning from my son, very early this morning. He was going to get the cows, right? It is hard work, and we milk 365 days of the year. And so when you look at the increased costs that we've had to absorb into our business recently, many of that because of the decisions of this government, just put electricity on the table to start with when you've got to cool thousands of litres of milk, and then the government's adding another tax on top of that as well, as if every cent doesn't matter. Well, in our business, every cent matters. So if we don't pay it as farmers, the consumer is going to pay it at the checkout when those costs can be passed on at a time of a cost of living crisis. It's a very smart move. Alternatively, the $50 million annual and recurring additional tax will have to be borne by individual farmers when it's either the supermarket or the buyer of their product doesn't actually pass on that cost back to the farmer themselves to cover that additional cost. Probably shows as well a lack of understanding of the agricultural supply and value chains demonstrated by the Office of Impact Analysis, which said the tax would not impact on producers because the cost would be passed through to the consumers. So it's either a fresh food tax on consumers or the farmers have to pay. But as far as the Office of Impact Analysis, when was the last time any of them tried to negotiate an increase in price from a Coles or Woolies or other buyers for a perishable product like milk that has to be produced, processed and sold and consumed pretty well immediately? You are in a very vulnerable position as a producer of that product. And what happens when the processor is signed a multi-year contract with one of these and the new government, the Labor government, is simply adding yet another tax and cost to that production and processing cost? Will the supermarket pass the costs on to consumers or refuse to negotiate with either the processors or those with direct contracts in relation to these additional costs? Now, we know that milk production across Australia is actually falling, and it is a critical product. The Standing Committee on Ag in November of 2023 actually recommended that the Australian government, as part of the National Food Plan, develop a specific strategy for reinvigorating the Australian dairy industry, one which lifts profitability and production while addressing the economic and environmental sustainability of the industry and identifies the resources and pathways required to achieve this. What we don't need is more taxes. The funny thing, the report didn't refer to the increased taxes on farmers now being proposed by the government, and often they have very finite margins. However, the government will definitely contribute to further decreasing milk production through its 450 gigs of buybacks from the farmers in the Murray-Darling Basin. The milk manufacturers came to see me last year and said, "We are really concerned about the lack of throughput and whether we can remain viable." But clearly the Labor government has no understanding of any of these realities or the impacts on the farmers themselves. And I can tell you what I actually see here. This is just the Labor's latest attack on our farmers, and actually another example of what I see as just the absolute contempt they have for us as farmers, the men and women who are producing some of the best food and fibre in the world. And what I see in this is just sheer contempt. Why otherwise would any Australian government tax their own farmers to pay for the biosecurity risks created by the international competitors? I mean, just to bring their products into this country, we're saying you farmers pay. I mean, that's just utter contempt. There's no other word for that. Effectively, what you're saying, what the government is saying, it means that we farmers, working our hearts out on the farm, are subsidising our competitors to compete against us in our Australian markets. Well, that's a great government initiative. You know, what a contemptuous thing to come up with. And can you imagine, I thought, what would that discussion have been like around the Labor cabinet table? I wonder how many farmers were around that table. Minister Watt maybe would have said, well, I've got a great idea. Let's increase taxes on our Australian farmers to pay for the biosecurity risks created by their overseas competitors. Obviously, those around the table said that's a genius idea. Let's make our farmers less competitive. Hey? Let's tax our farmers to subsidise overseas farmers. Now, what a great idea. Our farmers already operate in a high cost of production environment, made even worse by Labor's increased costs of energy, increased costs and shortages of workers, overwhelming red and green tape. The list is endless. But I suspect this is just the next step the Labor government will actually use to get rid of more farmers by default. After all, shutting down the live sheep exports and putting sheep producers and associated small businesses out of business. I was at Wage and Woolarama last week. You want to walk a mile in those communities where those farmers and those business people are already in great distress. And some of them, I could see, already have mental health problems. So perhaps they see this as a way of reducing emissions by default and freeing up more productive agriculture and food-producing land for wind, solar and transmission lines. After all, the government is supporting the NHMRC's attack on the consumption of red meat. And here, I actually thought the National Health and Medical Research Council's purpose is actually to develop and support high-quality guidelines for clinical practice and public health, not to attack farmers and food production in Australia. Perhaps the NHMRC and others think there's a better impact on the environment to ship beef and meat into Australia from overseas rather than to consume locally high-quality, best meat produced here in Australia. Perhaps the NHMRC doesn't support the health benefits of a typical 150-gram serving of great Australian beef, and that actually contains 12 essential nutrients recommended for good health and is a great source of protein, iron, zinc and vitamin B. Not a bad outcome. But that's just another example of a government who doesn't respect and value and actually literally shows contempt for our Australian farmers. Every farmer out there today that's working their heart out, thank you for the food you produce, some of the best and highest quality food in the world. And I don't want to see you go through even more costs by this government. But there is a lot missing from the bill before the House. Who is actually going to pay and how much will each one pay? Who are those certain producers mentioned in the legislation? And the government is clearly ignoring the levies already being paid. That $500 million annually already being paid by farmers towards biosecurity, research, innovation, development. We are carrying our own weight. How's the government going to collect the tax from industries that currently don't even contribute to the existing industry-imposed ag levy system? Well, good luck with that one. and how much of the $50 million raised every year will actually go to the new levy or tax collection agencies or bodies you're going to need to do this. But even more importantly, Labor clearly sees this tax as a revenue raiser. It's just going into consolidated revenue, but we hear about a new body, but who knows exactly where and how the Labor government will actually spend this. It may not necessarily go into managing biosecurity at all, but I've actually got a good suggestion. Perhaps the Labor government could use it to better protect our northern borders, where recently boatloads of asylum seekers are coming ashore. They came from Indonesia, where two major threats to the Australian livestock industry exist: foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. And yet these people are walking in the top end of Australia, putting at risk at least $31 billion in production value. What about that very live biosecurity risk? Well, Australian farmers feed over 61 up to 75 million people here and overseas with really great quality food. And one of my local dairy farmers, and we're constantly under pressure, the layer upon layer of red tape, the pressures on us in business just to survive. And this farmer said to me, we lived through the enormous pressure of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, and now we're facing the Nature Positive Act. We don't know what's in that for us as farmers either, but it is going to add more pressure to our businesses and ourselves. This farmer actually said to me, he produces milk that feeds 60,000 people a year. And he said, Nola, wouldn't it be great if someone just said thank you and let me get on with it? And that's what I'd say to this government. Don't add further cost to the very good people getting up at all hours of the morning and working their hearts out to actually provide Australians and people overseas with some of the best quality food and fibre in the world. In the world. Do not treat these people with contempt. Show some respect and value what they do. Because if there are shortages of food and shortage of nutritious food, then there's going to be a massive challenge for the government of the day. In Western Australia, we only have just over 100 dairy farmers left to produce great quality fresh milk. So what we don't need is just the next tax and what I see as a lack of respect for what we do in applying this tax in the first place. How many other countries that we export to charge their local farmers for biosecurity measures from the products that we export into those countries? How many other governments actually do that to their farmers? But that's what we've got here. A government that says, we're going to tax you farmers to pay for the risk created by those people who are going to put those other, I'll use dairy again, there's a lot of product that comes from overseas on our shelves. And they compete with our products every day. And so what this government is doing is saying, well, too bad, so sad. You not only have to compete with them on the shelf, you also have to pay for the biosecurity risk that they've imposed to this country. I mean, I tell you, this just takes some real beating, doesn't it? It just confounds you to think that a government would show this level of disrespect and contempt for its farmers. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a very proud dairy farmer, but one that had to start and learn a very steep learning curve, I'd say to every member of Parliament and everyone that hasn't been on a farm or lived our life or worked their hearts out and looked after the environment as we do it and produced some of the best quality food and fibre that often in a country where we haven't lived through the ravages of what some of the Europeans did during World War II and were desperately hungry. In this country, we make sure that Australians, as much as they can afford, have access to great food. And we do it day in and day out. All we ask for is a little bit of respect for the job that we do, and we don't need a government doing what we've seen today.